What is a pre-sentence report? What's a Gladue report? So both of these things basically come down to telling your story to the judge after you've been found guilty or pleaded guilty and you're getting your sentence. Okay? Before the judge gives you your sentence, they get a chance to read through something that someone has prepared, a report that tells your story. That's basically what it is. I'll drag that out for another 10 minutes now. My name's Nelson J. Peters. I'm a lawyer in Moncton. I do criminal defense. I'm really good at sentences because I've done a lot. I think I worked it out. It's like over 1,000 sentences. Because anyways. So the legal foundation for the pre-sentence report and the Gladue report is based in section 721 of the Criminal Code. I'll just tell you what it says. It's basically that a probation officer, upon request by a person who's been found guilty, pleaded guilty, can write a report to help the court in imposing a sentence. Okay, and they highlight that this is whether you get a discharge. That's that funny way to be convicted but not have a criminal record. I'll talk about that later. So you're telling your story. I guess I have to say a little bit about this. There's a difference between being found guilty and sentencing. So like if you go to court, you say, I just want to plead out, you'll often get sentenced on the same day, right? So I got a DUI. I'm going to admit to what they're saying. It's this much fine amount. Then the judge will just sentence you there. Okay, you've got a $1,500 fine and a 1-year driving prohibition or whatever. You can also break those up, right? So I'm going to plead guilty here, but Your Honor, I'd like to request a pre-sentence report for my client. We're going to be applying for a discharge. We're going to try to get this guy out of having a criminal record. That's the big one that it's used for. You can also use it for other stuff, like if there's extenuating circumstances. Pre-sentence reports are a good way to, like I said, tell your story. So you'll sit down with this probation officer and you'll tell them, you go back to the childhood. They'll talk about childhood issues. Was there abuse? What were you subjected to? What were you around? Other stuff might be addiction, mental health issues, which you see a lot in criminal court. The most important thing that you can do in a report like this is to talk about what you're doing to address your issues. Because it's not just what brings you to the court that's important. What you want to do is focus on what you're doing after that, because that's that sentencing principle of rehabilitation. Okay? This is why, you should believe that I'm not going to come back here for this. That's all you're trying to do with sentencing, Tell the judge a story that they can believe. So here's an example of where, a PSR, a pre-sentence report would be useful. I think this was in Alberta. This is for like a theft from an employer, which is almost always jail. Yes, the woman was stealing from her employer because she had an abusive husband with a gambling problem. And he was like, I need money, and he would abuse her. So that's she knew she was doing something wrong, right? She's met those elements of a guilty plea, but it's also okay, I understand why. Those kinds of circumstances are important, I'm going to spend more time talking about the Gladue reports, though, which are basically the same thing as a PSR, pre-sentence report, telling your story, but it's focusing on the particular circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. Okay, it's mostly the same information: mental health, addiction, social factors. But if it's a good report, and the ones I've seen are pretty good, you'll go deeper. And with Aboriginal people, this is what gets your guys the deal. This is what makes the difference. And if you got a Crown who gets it, sometimes you don't even need a Gladue report, because you see, if you spend time anywhere with an Aboriginal population, you see the effects of colonization. Let's call it that. The effects of the rupture of the Crown's trust with Aboriginals. Anyways, this comes from reforms to the Criminal Code in 1996. Particular section is 718.2, but it tells the judge when they're sentencing, they have to consider any anything else than jail that's reasonable. But then there's this part that says, with particular attention to the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. So what does that mean? Well, this is why they call it a Gladue report, because it goes up to the Supreme Court and you have these lawyers arguing over what it means. But what the Supreme Court decided was you have to look at these particular circumstances and apply them to Aboriginal offenders differently. We have to treat them differently. That's basically what it means. Pay attention to what brought them here. So what are the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders? Why would they put this in? Why do they get special treatment? You might be wondering. Let's talk about that. Here's a report. Aboriginal offenders, a critical situation. Let's talk about these circumstances. Aboriginal people make up about 4% of the Canadian population as of February 2013. 23.2% of the federal inmate population is Aboriginal. So that'd be First Nation, Métis, or Inuit. The incarceration rate for Aboriginal adults in Canada is estimated to be 10 times higher than non-Aboriginals. Think about that. It's also increasing, and this is what's really scary, is that it's increasing quickly. And the other thing is that the Aboriginal population in Canada is increasing incredibly quickly. So you have people who are overrepresented massively in jail, and that population is increasing massively. Where's this going? That's why it exists, okay? Aboriginal women, it's worse. Overrepresented, 4% of the population, 33.6 of all federally sentenced women. That's like the big stuff. Over 2 years, you go to the pen, okay? Youth, it's the same, just higher. They also talk about how Aboriginal offender rates are on the rise, like in the prairies. They've got this part about how the prairie region of the Correctional Service of Canada, so the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, which I'm from, I know a little bit about because I grew up there. Aboriginals are 46% of the inmate population. Stony Mountain in Manitoba, 65%. Saskatchewan Penitentiary, 63%. Regional Psychiatric Center Saskatoon, 55% Aboriginal. Edmonton Institution for Women, 56%. So the Prairie region leads the country in double bunking, lockdowns, self-harm incidents, inmate homicides, and assaults. On the lighter side, this reminds me of a joke I heard from a guy in Portage la Prairie, a native guy. We were playing pool. He says, what do you call a white guy in jail surrounded by 100 Indians? I go, what? Bitch. Maybe I shouldn't have told that. But anyways, situation is not good. It's really bad, actually. Okay, and that's why I'm spending more time on this part. It's because this is important. I don't know if people out east don't realize it. So when I'm doing my thing, when I'm doing a sentence and I've got a Gladue report, what I try to highlight is the word particular. Okay, I try to get fancy. You just try to communicate it, right? So the word particular is related to the French particulier, which means specific. That's what I try and do. I try to get specific. Let's not talk Aboriginals. What does that mean? This guy. Let's talk about him. Let's talk about, his father who went to residential school and came back having been sexually abused and then passed that on. Let's talk about his uncle who didn't come back from residential school. Okay, let's talk about his mom who was seized from her parents. Grew up in a white neighborhood. She got called names every day. This guy is the result of that. Take some responsibility, Crown. And you try to say that in a nice way. You just try to connect the dots for them. And I saw this, I was in Fort McMurray for a year, working with Legal Aid Alberta. So there, you try to talk about the tribes, right? There was a lot of Crees. Crees are all over there, from Quebec to Northwest Territories. There's different kinds of Crees too. There's a lot of Dene as well. which is kind of, they're interesting. So I would say of all of my legal aid files that I got out there, about a third of them were from Janvier, which is, I've got I couldn't believe it, but I looked at the population for the rural municipality. Janvier has a population of 414 people. And that whole Wood Buffalo, the whole area from like further south than Fort McMurray all the way up to the Northwest Territories, that whole area has a population of 71,000, about 72,000 in 2016, which is the same day as that 414. So we're talking about an area that's about 0.5% of the population, 0.5% of the population, which is a third of my files. It's really bad. So you talk about, these particular circumstances. You talk about, this is what they were like before white people came in. That was a really bad treaty, by the way. They gave away the oil sands, and they've cut deals and stuff. But, that one, Treaty 6, I might do something on that later. It's just they got really bad deals. The Mi'kmaq in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they signed a peace and friendship treaty. So they technically haven't signed away anything, it's too complex to open up, but there's these massive problems that no one's addressing. So what happens? We end up dealing with it one person at a time, in criminal court. Anyways, connected back to the pre-sentence report, all right? So what sort of things do you talk about? So you want to talk about their family, where they grew up, what support they have now. You want to talk about, the background of the person. Maybe they were going through something at the time. Maybe they're going through, mental health episode at the time. If you've already pleaded guilty, that's not going to be about your guilt or not, but it might help explain things, right? If you're dealing with the death of your mother and you're drinking, and that's what gets you a DUI. That's important. Gladue report, you want to talk about you want to talk about Aboriginal heritage. Like I said, make it specific to your guy. This is why he's here. Talk about the residential schools. Talk about their community. Talk about, their loss of culture, the role of substance abuse in their life, racism. Have they seen violence? You try to dredge all that stuff out. Try to deal with it, process it. So the sort of things that you could use this for would be if you're asking for house arrest instead of jail. You also might be trying to, cut off some days from your jail sentence. Maybe you're trying to get probation, probation as opposed to house arrest or whatever. Maybe you're trying to get alternative measures. So that's not even a criminal conviction. Or that thing called a discharge, which is, it's like a conviction, but it's discharged, so it doesn't count as a criminal record. These are all the sort of things where you can tell your story, and that might sway the balance on an offense and on the judge's sentence. Because this is the one thing I hear all the time. The guys say, I don't get a chance to tell my story. And I get that. I get how it's frustrating. The judge doesn't want to hear, guilty with an explanation. Sure, this is your explanation. Okay? What you don't want to do is try to deny guilt. If you go into your report and you're like, well, I still didn't do it, that's not going to help you either. But all that other stuff will, or at least it might. And it'll the very least, it's a chance to give the judge a fuller picture of who you are before you get that sentence and you deal with whatever it is. Okay, that's it. Thank you.